Okay, so, you've been sending over some really interesting stuff lately.
Yeah.
And this time it seems like you're really focused on, you know,
Yeah.
the heart of learning and remembering, right?
Yeah.
Like how we actually get stuff to stick.
Exactly. Yeah,
You've got these sources that are all about two key strategies, I guess you could call them.
Mhm.
One is generative learning, which is all about, really making sense of new information, building your own understanding.
Yeah.
And then the other is retrieval practice,
Right.
which we've talked about quite a bit on the show before, but it's that idea of bringing information back to mind, strengthening those memories.
Exactly. And it's so interesting how those two things
Yeah.
connect.
Yeah, and that seems to be what we're really going to unpack in this deep dive.
Absolutely.
Like, how do those two approaches work?
Yeah.
Where do they intersect? And most importantly, for our listeners, what can we actually take away from this to learn better, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting things is that the research on these two things sometimes feels a little bit siloed.
Yeah, it does. It feels like they're often studied separately, like
Yeah.
two different paths.
Yeah, and it is fascinating because both of them have been shown to be way more effective than just, sitting down and rereading your notes or
Oh, yeah, for sure. Rereading is not very effective
not a good strategy.
at all
Yeah.
compared to these two.
Okay, so let's really break this down.
Okay.
Your sources talk about follow-up learning tasks,
Right.
which I guess is basically what you do after
Sure.
you've initially been exposed to some new information.
Yeah, the stuff you do afterwards to really make it stick.
And these tasks have two key elements.
Yeah,
Right?
it's right.
The first one being the extent to which you have to actively make sense of the information.
Yes, make sense of it, process it deeply.
So this is where generative learning really comes in.
Exactly. This is the heart of generative learning.
Like organizing the information,
Yeah.
putting it in your own words, coming up with your own examples.
Right? All of those things. And as Fiorella and Mayer talk about, the idea is that when you do these kinds of things, you're actually building a mental representation
Right.
of the material.
It's like you're creating a framework in your mind.
Exactly. A framework that connects to what you already know.
So it's not just these isolated facts floating around.
Right.
It's connecting to this bigger picture.
Exactly. You're integrating it with your existing knowledge.
And then the second element
Yeah.
is how much the task requires you to actually pull the information back out of your memory.
Ah, yes, retrieval.
Retrieval practice.
Which is really where Karpik and Roediger and Butler have done so much work.
Yeah, and they really emphasize that this is, a core mechanism for learning.
It is the act of retrieving strengthens the memory.
It's like exercising a muscle.
Yes, exactly. The more you use it,
Yeah.
the stronger it gets,
Yeah.
and the easier it becomes to access that information later on.
So it sounds like these two elements, sense making and retrieval,
Mm.
they can kind of exist on their own.
They can, and they do, and that's a key point that the research highlights.
You can have a learning task that's really heavy on one and light on the other,
Right.
or somewhere in between.
Exactly. Researchers can manipulate these independently.
Like, how so?
Well, take the level of generative activity, for instance.
Oh,
You could have something as simple as just rereading a text, which isn't very generative.
yeah, you're not really doing that much.
Right, it's very passive.
Yeah.
But then you could have something like inventing your own examples, which requires a much deeper level of processing and understanding.
Yeah, that would really force you to grapple with the concepts.
Exactly, and the same goes for retrieval.
Oh, right. So how much you're actually having to recall from memory,
Right, you could have everything right there in front of you, like an open book test.
which Agarwal and others have looked at quite a bit.
Yes, and they've shown that open book testing is actually a good thing in many cases.
It's not always a bad thing.
No, not at all. But it's very different from having to retrieve everything from memory in a closed book situation.
Right. So it's like a spectrum from you have all the answers right there to you have to generate everything yourself.
Exactly. And the research is very clear that both generative learning and retrieval practice are way more beneficial than just passively reviewing or rereading your notes.
So we've got Broad and Fiorella and Mayer who've really championed generative learning.
Yes, their work is excellent.
And then we've got Agarwal and Carpenter and Yang who've done a lot of work on retrieval practice.
Yes, all of them have made really strong cases for their respective approaches.
But it sounds like what's less clear is how these two things work together.
That's right. It's like they've been studied in parallel, but not necessarily how they interact.
And I wonder if part of that is just because they kind of came from different academic camps.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. You've got educational psychology, which has traditionally been more focused on generative learning,
Right.
especially in classroom settings.
Mm-hmm.
And they've often looked at more complex topics and measured things like comprehension and application.
Right. And then you've got cognitive psychology,
Yeah.
which has really focused on the mechanisms of memory. And they've often used simpler factual content and measured things like recall, often over longer periods of time.
Right. So different focus, different materials, different measures.
It's like they're both looking at different sides of the same coin.
Exactly. And as that paper you sent puts it, the relationship between these two areas has been expandable.
Meaning there's still so much more to explore.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to try to do today.
To figure out where those connections are and what they mean for us as learners.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so let's dive into each of these ecospheres a little bit more.
Okay.
Starting with generative learning.
Right.
It's really all about making sense of things right.
It is. It's about that active processing, that deep understanding.
So what are some specific examples of activities that fall under generative learning?
Well, there are actually a ton of different things you can do.
Right.
Things like creating diagrams to visualize concepts, developing your own examples to illustrate ideas.
Right.
Explaining something in your own words, like you're teaching it to someone else.
Yeah, like if you had to teach it to me right now.
Exactly. And Chi and Wiley and Fiorella and Mayer talk about this quite a bit.
Yeah.
The key is that you're actively working with the information and integrating it with your existing knowledge.
And this often happens after you've initially encountered the material.
Right. It's not usually the first thing you do, but it can be done whether you have the original learning resources in front of you or not.
Okay, so open book or closed book?
Exactly.
So for generative learning, the focus is on building that strong understanding.
That's right. Building that mental model.
Okay, now what about retrieval practice? What's their main thing?
Their focus is really on memory consolidation.
Making those memories stick.
Yes, exactly.
And they often use simpler factual content like vocabulary lists or short passages.
Right, things that are easier to test and measure recall for.
And Roediger and Karpike have done a lot of work in this area.
Oh yes, they are giants in the field of retrieval practice.
So their main goal is to strengthen those memories for the long haul.
Yes, long-term retention is the key outcome they're looking for.
And usually they measure this with delayed tests, right?
Exactly. They want to see if you can still remember the information after some time has passed.
So it's like one is building the model and the other is making sure the model is really sturdy.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, now where did these two areas of research first start to bump into each other?
Well, the paper you sent actually highlights a really important study from 2011 by Karpik and Blunt. And this was a kind of first meeting point for these two areas.
What did they do?
They directly compared free recall, which is heavily retrieval-based, with open book concept mapping.
Which is more generative.
Exactly. And the surprising finding was that free recall actually led to better learning outcomes.
Oh, wow. So just practicing retrieving the information was better than creating a concept map.
That's right. Which really got people in the generative learning world thinking.
Like, wait a minute, maybe we're missing something here.
Exactly.
So this kind of sparked a reassessment of generative learning.
It did. And one key insight was that a lot of tasks that were traditionally considered generative might actually have a hidden retrieval component.
Hidden down.
Well, think about things like writing in a learning journal, or trying to explain a worked out example to yourself.
Okay.
Or even learning by teaching someone else. Like if you were explaining this to someone who had no idea what generative learning was, Knuckles and Rowell and Renkel have all written about this. And the thing is, when you do these kinds of tasks, you often don't have the original material right in front of you.
Right, you're having to come up with it yourself.
Exactly. So you're implicitly having to retrieve information from memory before you can even start generating your explanation or your journal entry or whatever it is.
So the very act of generating requires you to first recall the information.
Right. It's like a built-in retrieval practice.
So maybe the benefits we see from these so-called generative tasks aren't just because of the generation part.
Exactly. Retrieval might be playing a bigger role than we initially thought.
And there are different mechanisms that might be at play here.
Yes. Things like elaborative retrieval.
Which is?
Where retrieving one piece of information kind of activates a network of related information.
Like it triggers those connections?
Exactly. And then there's episodic context updating.
Okay, what's that?
That's where you're essentially adding more contextual details to the information you're retrieving.
So it's like you're creating a richer memory trace.
Right, which makes it easier to access later on.
And Carpenter and Karpike have done some really important work trying to understand these mechanisms.
Yes, they've been instrumental in shedding light on how retrieval actually works at a cognitive level.
So the generative learning folks started realizing that retrieval might be a key ingredient they hadn't fully appreciated.
That's right. It was a bit of an aha moment for the field.
So what happened next? How did their research change in response to this?
Well, there were at least a couple of major shifts.
Okay.
One was that they started incorporating pure retrieval practice tasks as control conditions in their studies.
So instead of just comparing a generative activity to restudying?
Right. They would also compare it to just practicing recalling the information without any generation involved.
So they could isolate the unique contribution of the generative part.
Exactly. And what they found was that even with this pure retrieval practice as a comparison, the generative tasks often still showed additional benefits.
Interesting. So there was something about the act of generating that was adding value above and beyond just retrieving the information.
That's right.
Okay, what was the other big shift?
And the other thing they started doing was explicitly manipulating whether the learning material was available during the generative tasks.
Okay, so open book versus closed book.
Exactly. They started comparing those two formats directly.
And this was inspired by Karpik and Blunt's findings.
Yes, and also by Agarwal's earlier work on open and closed book testing.
So what did they find when they compared these formats for generative learning tasks?
One of the most consistent findings was that when generative tasks were done closed book, the quality and quantity of the generative activity often suffered. Well, for example, if they were doing concept mapping, the closed book maps would often be less detailed.
Oh, so they wouldn't include as many connections or as much information.
Right, and if they were writing explanations, the closed book explanations would be less thorough.
Less in-depth.
Yes, and this was true across a whole range of tasks.
Like even drawing.
Even drawing, they found that closed book conditions often led to lower quality drawings.
So it seems like having to rely solely on memory was making it harder for people to fully engage in the generative aspect of the task.
That's right. It's like having all the pieces in front of you versus having to remember them all and then try to put them together.
Yeah, and that makes sense. If you can't recall all the relevant information, it's going to be harder to connect it all meaningfully.
Exactly. It's like the closed book format creates a bottleneck for the generative process.
So it limits how much you can actually generate.
Right, because you're constrained by what you can recall.
Okay. But what about the actual learning outcomes? Did open book consistently lead to better learning than closed book?
That's where the findings get a bit more interesting.
How so?
Well, the results on learning outcomes were actually quite mixed.
Meaning?
Some studies did find that open book led to better learning,
Okay.
but others found no significant difference between open book and closed book.
So even though the quality of the activity might be lower in the closed book condition, it didn't always translate to worse learning.
Right, and there are a few reasons for that.
Okay.
One is that in many of these studies, the closed book implementations weren't necessarily ideal in terms of maximizing the benefits of retrieval practice.
Like how? What were they doing wrong?
Well, for example, they might not have had any breaks between study and retrieval attempts.
So they were testing people's memory immediately after they had studied.
Right, which isn't really giving retrieval practice a chance to work its magic.
Yeah, you need a little bit of forgetting to happen.
Exactly, and they also often didn't repeat retrieval attempts.
So they only gave people one shot at recalling the information.
Right, which again isn't the best way to strengthen those memories.
You want to space it out, give people multiple opportunities.
Exactly, and in some cases, the retrieval success rates were also quite low.
Meaning people were struggling to recall much of the information.
Right, so the retrieval practice that was happening in those closed book conditions wasn't very effective retrieval practice.
So it's like they weren't really giving retrieval a fair chance.
Exactly.
But what's really interesting is that even in those situations where the retrieval wasn't that great, it sometimes still compensated for the lower quality generative activity. So the overall learning outcomes ended up being similar to the open book condition.
That's right, which suggests that even imperfect retrieval can still be beneficial.
Okay, but what about the studies where closed book generative tasks did lead to better learning? What was different about those?
One common element in those studies was that learners had the chance to go back and look at the material after trying the closed book task.
So they got to fill in any gaps or correct any errors they had made?
Exactly. So they were forced to retrieve from memory first, but then they got to check their work and solidify their understanding.
So like a cycle retrieve, generate, check, revise.
Right, and that seems to be a very effective way to incorporate retrieval into generative learning.
So it sounds like the generative learning field has really been influenced by retrieval practice research.
Oh, absolutely. There's been a huge shift in how they think about these things.
But what about the other way around? Has retrieval practice research been similarly influenced by generative learning?
That's a good question, and it seems like the influence has been less pronounced.
Why do you think that is?
Well, take the research on practice quizzing, for example. The emphasis there is often on how quizzes facilitate retrieval and help identify knowledge gaps.
Right. Which makes sense. That's kind of the core of retrieval practice.
Exactly. And while some quiz questions do require more than just recalling facts.
Like those higher level questions.
Right, the ones that ask you to explain a concept or draw an inference.
Yeah.
The benefits of those questions are often attributed to things like desirable difficulties or transfer-appropriate processing.
Rather than to the constructive aspect of generative learning.
Exactly. They recognize that these questions are more challenging and might lead to better transfer.
Yeah.
But they don't necessarily frame it in terms of actively building a deeper understanding.
So they're not really emphasizing the generative part, even though it's happening.
Right. And when they measure learning outcomes, they often focus on things like the number of items correctly recalled.
Yeah, like how many answers you got, right?
Exactly. Rather than looking at the quality of the explanations or inferences that people are generating.
So it's more about the quantity of what you remember than the depth of your understanding.
That's a good way to put it. And the paper suggests a couple of reasons for this lack of cross-pollination.
Yeah.
One is simply differences in terminology.
Like what?
Well, the term transfer, for example, can mean different things in the two fields.
Right. How so?
In retrieval practice, transfer often refers to the ability to apply knowledge in a new context, which implicitly involves some generative processing.
Right. You have to generate a solution or an explanation.
Exactly. But in generative learning, transfer is often viewed as an outcome measure.
Rather than a description of the activity itself.
Right. So they might be talking about similar things, but using different language.
And that can lead to confusion.
It can. And then the other reason is implementation quality.
Oh, right. Like we talked about before.
Exactly. Just as generative learning research might not always implement retrieval practice effectively.
Right.
Retrieval practice research might not always do a great job of designing or analyzing generative learning components.
So it goes both ways.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, so we've seen how these fields have interacted and where they haven't.
Mm-hmm.
What about direct comparisons? Have researchers tried to pit generative learning and retrieval practice against each other?
They have, actually.
Like how?
Well, that Karpik and Blunt study we talked about earlier, that was a direct comparison, what's sometimes called a horse race study.
Try to see which one comes out on top.
Exactly. But as we discussed, there were some criticisms of that study.
Especially around how they implemented the concept mapping.
Right. It wasn't necessarily a fair fight.
And the authors of this paper argue that these kinds of, which is better, comparisons are often not very useful.
Yeah, they can be a bit misleading.
Because ultimately, each strategy has its own strengths.
Exactly. They serve different purposes.
So generative learning is about building that robust understanding.
That's right.
And retrieval practice is about consolidating memories.
Exactly. So it's more about understanding when to use each one.
Based on what your goal is. Okay, so that brings us to sequencing.
Yes.
Is it generally better to do generative learning first and then retrieval practice?
That's the natural assumption.
Right. You need to understand something before you can really remember it.
Right. The construction before consolidation idea?
It seems logical.
It does, but the research is a bit more complicated than that.
How so?
Well, there was a study in 2019 by Roel and Knuckles where they manipulated the quality of the learning text.
Okay.
And they found that when the text was really good, retrieval practice actually led to better learning outcomes.
Oh, interesting. So if you already have a good foundation from the text,
right,
just focusing on consolidation is more effective.
It seems that way.
But if the text was poor, generative learning was more beneficial.
Right, because in that case, you really need to work on building your understanding first.
So it depends on the quality of your initial learning experience.
Exactly.
Okay. What other research has looked at sequencing?
Well, there was a 2021 study by O'Day and Karpik.
Okay. That found no added benefit of doing generative learning before retrieval practice.
Oh, interesting.
But again, there were some potential issues with how they implemented the generative task.
Right.
And then there's a more surprising finding.
What's that?
A study by Roel and colleagues in 2022 found that retrieval practice before open book generation of examples actually led to better learning.
Oh, wow. So retrieving first and then generating.
That's right. And this was even true when learners had a pretty low initial understanding of the material.
That is surprising.
It is, and it suggests that maybe retrieving first makes the generative activity easier.
Like you've primed your memory with the key information.
Exactly. And they also suggest that poorly done generative tasks might actually interfere with later retrieval.
Oh. So if you generate a bunch of incorrect stuff,
right,
it could mess you up later on.
Exactly.
Wow. So it's definitely more complicated than just saying understand, than remember.
It is. The optimal sequence seems to depend on a lot of factors. Like what are some of the things that might influence which sequence is better?
Well, the paper talks about a few potential moderators.
Okay.
One is the relevance of the initial activity to the subsequent activity.
Okay, so how much does the first task actually help you with the second task?
Exactly. So, for example, if the generative task requires you to recall specific pieces of information,
Mm-hmm.
then practicing retrieval first might be really helpful.
Like if I need to remember the steps of a process in order to explain how it works?
Exactly. But if the generative task allows you to just look up the information you need,
Then the sequence might not matter as much.
right, because you don't need to rely on your memory as much.
Another factor they mention is the time delay between study and the learning activities.
Right. So how much time has passed since you initially learned the material?
And how does that play into it?
Well, if you're doing the activities immediately after studying,
Mm-hmm.
retrieving first might not make a big difference for later generative tasks.
Because the information is still fresh in your mind?
Exactly. But if there's a longer delay,
Yeah.
then that initial retrieval practice can be really valuable.
Because it makes the information more accessible again.
Right. It's like a mental warm-up.
And the third moderator they mention is the degree of control learners have over their focus during the generative task.
Right. So how much freedom they have to choose what they focus on.
So in a more open-ended task like journal writing,
Mm-hmm.
prior retrieval might not be as helpful.
Because you can kind of choose what you want to write about.
Right.
Yeah.
But in tasks with specific prompts or questions,
Yeah.
retrieval first could be really beneficial.
Because it ensures that you're recalling the specific information you need to answer the prompt.
Exactly. It helps you focus on the most relevant stuff.
Okay, so we've talked about the direct effects of these strategies on learning and remembering.
Right.
But they also have these indirect effects on our metacognition,
Yes, they do.
our ability to monitor and regulate our own learning.
That's right, and that's a really important part of the story. So how does retrieval practice influence this monitoring and regulation process?
Well, there's a lot of evidence that retrieval practice improves metacognitive monitoring.
Specifically what's called meta-memory.
Right, which is your awareness of your own memory capabilities.
How well you think you remember things.
Exactly. And when you try to retrieve information and you get it wrong or you can't recall it at all, that gives you a really clear signal about what you need to work on.
So it helps you become more accurate in judging what you actually know.
Right, instead of overestimating your understanding.
It gives you a dose of reality.
Exactly. And this isn't just about rote memorization.
Yeah.
It also applies to more complex learning from texts.
So it's not just about remembering facts.
No, it's about understanding how well you've grasped the material.
Okay. And what about generative learning?
Yeah.
How does engaging in sense-making activities impact our metacognition?
Well, generative learning primarily influences metacomprehension,
Which is
your awareness of how well you understand something. So when you're trying to explain something or draw connections or come up with examples, you get insights into how well your mental model is working.
like, do you see how the different ideas fit together?
Right. Are you able to make those connections, and does it all make sense to you?
So it's like retrieval fluency gives you a sense of how well you've memorized something. And the ease and coherence with which you can generate explanations or examples gives you a sense of how well you understand it.
That's a great way to summarize it.
So they're both giving you feedback, but it's different types of feedback.
Exactly.
Okay, so if we're doing a task that combines both retrieval and generation,
Yeah.
like a closed book generative task where you have to recall information to generate an explanation, how do those different metacognitive cues interact?
That's a really interesting question, and it could be that they sometimes provide conflicting information.
Like how?
Well, you might be able to recall a concept really easily,
Okay.
which makes you think you know it well. But then you might struggle to explain it or connect it to other ideas.
So your memory is good, but your understanding isn't as solid.
Exactly. And then it becomes tricky to figure out how to regulate your learning based on those conflicting cues.
Like, do you go back and restudy the definition, or do you try to find more examples? Or
Right. It's not always clear what the best course of action is.
And the type of information you need to regulate your learning might also be different.
Yeah. If you just get a fact wrong on a quiz, the correct answer might be all you need.
But if you struggle with a more complex generative task,
Right.
you might need more guidance or explanation.
Exactly. Like maybe you need to see a worked out example or have someone explain the concept in a different way.
So it's a lot more nuanced than just saying, oh, I got this wrong, I need to study it more.
It is, and it's an area where more research is definitely needed.
To understand how learners can use both metamemory and metacomprehension cues effectively?
Exactly, because if we can figure that out, it could really help people become more efficient and self-directed learners.
Okay, so based on all this, what are the big takeaways for future research?
The paper outlines 3 key tenets that I think are really important.
Okay.
The first is implementation quality.
We've talked about that a bit already.
We have, and it's crucial that researchers are using well-designed and well-executed versions of both generative learning and retrieval practice.
Right. No more comparing apples to oranges.
Exactly. And the authors really encourage more collaboration between researchers from the 2 fields.
So they can learn from each other and make sure they're implementing things properly.
Exactly. And the second tenet is to view these 2 types of activities as allies, not opponents.
Right. Stop trying to figure out which one is better.
Exactly, because they both have so much to offer.
And the focus should be on how we can combine them.
Right, to create powerful learning experiences.
Like maybe generative learning helps us build a strong knowledge structure, and then spaced retrieval helps us maintain that structure over time.
That's a great way to think about it.
Okay, and the third tenet?
The third tenet is to take a more holistic view.
Meaning?
Well, to consider both the direct effects on learning and the indirect effects on self-regulation and metacognition.
So not just how well we learn the content,
Right.
but also how these activities make us better learners overall.
Exactly. And this is especially important for complex topics that require multiple rounds of learning and engagement.
Right, because it's not just about learning the facts, it's about becoming a more strategic learner.
Exactly.
So we need to understand how generative learning and retrieval practice can help us do both.
Absolutely.
And the authors also point out that we need to keep digging into the cognitive mechanisms involved.
Yes, we need to understand how these things work at a deeper level.
To figure out how they achieve their effects and if there are any mechanistic links between them.
Right, and that could lead to even more effective strategies for combining them.
So a more fundamental understanding could unlock even more potential. Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into the relationship between these 2 learning powerhouses.
It has been.
So for you, our listener, what's the big takeaway from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that both generative learning and retrieval practice are incredibly valuable tools.
Yeah.
And understanding how they work and how they can potentially complement each other can really take your learning to the next level.
It's not about finding one best method.
No, it's about using both strategically.
And the paper also talks about some practical implications for how we can use learning strategies more effectively.
Yeah, one key point is that it's not just about how often you use a strategy, but how well you use it.
Right. Just going through the motions isn't enough.
Exactly. Retrieval needs to be successful, and generative activities need to be high quality.
So it's not just about checking the box.
No, it's about really engaging with the material.
Another important aspect is what's called conditional knowledge.
Right, knowing when and why to use different strategies.
So understanding that retrieval is really good for consolidation, and generative learning is great for building understanding.
Exactly, and that can help you make better choices about what to do in different situations.
It's about becoming a more metacognitive learner.
Yes, being more aware of your own learning process.
And then finally, the paper emphasizes that effective learning often involves coordinating different strategies.
Right, thinking about how you can combine retrieval and generation in different ways.
Either within a single task or across a sequence of activities.
Exactly, it's all about finding what works best for you.
And the role of educators is really